Welcome back to the Forum Book Club with Vivian Dudro, our senior editor, Joseph Pierce, one of our great authors, myself, Father Festo, the publisher of Ignatius Press. And we're continuing our discussion of Michael Kurek's book, The Sound of Beauty. And we got so engaged last week that we didn't quite meet our goal of doing the first three chapters. So we'll start with chapter 3 today. The first 6 chapters, he organizes them well. How music communicates as physical matter, in psychology of perception, to the emotions, to culture with classical music, to culture with popular music, and to culture or to the spiritual soul. So it's a fascinating book by someone who really has a good vantage point to write from. He's a composer himself who studied under the more modernist and postmodernist teachers and influences, and himself worked his way out of that because he wanted to write music that he could enjoy listening to himself and that his friends could enjoy listening to. But so he has a deep knowledge of both classical music, the modernist or postmodernist music, the atonal, chromatic scale music, and is able to communicate to us what it is that's valuable in all those things. So shall we jump right into chapter 3, or do either of you have any preparatory remarks?
No, I'd make one additional comment to your introductory remarks about Michael Kurek there, and that apart from being one of the most prominent classical music composers alive today, he also taught composition, musical composition at Vanderbilt University for about 30 years or something. So he's certainly a man who knows what he's talking about, and he's a revert to the Catholic faith, having drifted off into evangelicalism.
Father, I'd like to give a brief shout out to another book on this topic, Our Surprised by Beauty by Robert Riley, because what he does in that book is he, in the back of it, interviews other musicians like Kurek who were trained in modernism and then wanted to write music that they could enjoy listening to. These interviews are fantastic in the back of that book. And then in the rest of the book, he goes through the modern composers who, in spite of the trends and the ignominy of still creating beauty, have done just that. And he lists them by name and their recordings and so on. So there are other musicians out there like Kurek who've been kind of swimming against the current at great price, at cost to themselves, by the way, because as he explains in this book, the biases in the academy and in the performing arts organizations and so on have kind of been against them. So just thought I'd throw that out.
Although the very encouraging thing is that nobody buys or listens to the postmodern stuff, and Michael Kurek's work is actually listened to and performed globally because people like it, because it's popular.
Yeah.
And he also, we'll get to this, but he has an appendix for those who want to kind of enter into the world of classical music, some of the key pieces they should be listening to. And with respect to Bob Riley's book, I who don't have a whole lot of knowledge or experience in a lot of these other writers, I was surprised to find in the 20th century and late 19th century so many composers who actually were composing new music, but on a classical model, which I think is timeless.
Yes, and unfortunately, they've been largely ignored. So the work that Kurek is doing and Bob Riley, it's really important for us to be aware.
So, chapter 3, how music communicates to the emotions. Any comments you want to make about that?
Well, I have a quote I want to discuss at the bottom of page 64 and top of 65. Because obviously, the thing with me is, the music. I think we tend to think about music as something which is emotional, right? The word is the word, and you can use it in a rational, incisive way, and it means something. Music seems to be much more abstract, and therefore it's about feelings and emotions. So I thought it was very good here when he roots music itself in something which transcends emotion. So a life lived and based upon feelings rather than upon objective truth can easily be disordered. Likewise, if the role of music in one's life is based upon feelings and emotions rather than upon the objectively proper role music should play in one's life or in one's thinking, it is likely to become disordered. If music itself were composed and performed with only emotional preparation and without objectively correct technical preparation on the part of the composer or performer, it would be a disaster. The musician can come out on stage and feel the music with all his heart, but the audience will not be moved if it is poorly composed and played. In other words, there's this direct correlation between precise reason, even in an empirical sense, and music. It's not just a question of abstract emotions. And I thought that was an important point that he made there.
What pages were you on? I missed the page number.
Yeah, I've just quoted the bottom 3 lines of page 64.
Oh,
and the
64.
Top 10,
okay, I see. All right, I got it. I thought it was 54.
top 10 lines or so of page 65.
Okay.
Well, I think an important follow-on to that, Joseph, is the very next paragraph on 65, where he says, emotions and actions, according to the church, can be rightly ordered or disordered if they are taken up in the virtues and not perverted by the vices. They are rightly ordered, and vice versa. In other words, we don't want to use the word emotion as if emotions are necessarily a bad thing. We're emotional beings, and so the question is, how do we train or corral our emotional life so that it responds correctly to the right things, right? And so, you think of Plato's ideas of education, that children, when they're young, need to be actually trained to respond emotionally correctly to the right things, so that when later on reason develops, the soul is already sort of rightly ordered in the right direction, and now reason can explain why this is good or this is bad. But early on, you actually want to help a child respond correctly emotionally to the good and the bad, right? To be attracted to the good, repulsed by the bad.
The key thing I was trying to point out was the fact that emotion has to be subject to truth, which means emotion has to be subject to reason. And if it's not subject to reason, it becomes disordered ipso facto. So I think that, and again, as regards music, in order to compose it well, play it well, perform it well, listen to it well, we have to actually engage the reason and not just the emotion. Not just the emotions, but the emotions need to be engaged as well. By the way, if we could go back a little bit, he explains what's required of the ideal listener. Could we read that?
Go ahead.
That's on page 56. He says, perhaps the ideal way of listening may be described as a combination of the best traits of those listed above. The ideal listener gives the music its due attention and follow the narrative in it, but without allowing critical analysis to interfere, meaning just yet. They may have extra musical associations, but do not allow those to distract from the music. They enjoy the sheer sound of the music, but not at the expense of paying attention to what's going on. This is the kind of listener who I think has the best experience with music. So in other words, when you're listening to music, it's the one art form that actually bypasses the intellect in the way you experience it more powerfully than actually other art forms do. And so you want to allow your emotions, provided the music is good music, you want your emotions to be engaged almost before the intellect starts analyzing. But what Michael was saying is your emotions are only going to be engaged in terms of an ordered way if what you listen to is beautiful. And if what you listen to is beautiful, it's a consequence of the rational approach to composition that he's talking about. In other words, the beautiful, which we're responding to emotionally, is never divorced from
the good and the true. It's a triune thing. So insofar as we're getting good emotions, ordered emotions, it's because of the reason that's actually in the thing that we're apprehending. And
Yes.
so these things are not at war, or they're not at variance. But I do agree with you. Obviously, a work of literature has to speak to us in its beauty first before we start looking at metaphors and other things that are going on in it.
And so this question of beauty, in order to prepare for this session, Father, I went back to Glory of the Lord by von Balthasar and reread some of his descriptions of what really is beauty. And he talks about the combination of the form and the splendor or radiance that comes through the form, right?
Yes.
This combination. So to create the form, you need all this skill. The art, what you talked about earlier, Joseph, like the artist who composes, the artist who plays, it takes all this mastery of the medium of music to do this well. And this takes discipline, takes training, it takes study, it takes all these things. But then for something to be beautiful, there's both this form that's been constructed, but then there's this inner radiance, it's kind of an elusive thing. And when these things come together, and now we, the subject who respond to it, if our emotional life is not just completely out of whack, hopefully we will respond with positive emotions toward the beautiful, and toward sin will recoil. This is the proper ordered emotional life. But this first experience of beauty is something that bypasses the intellect. When you stand before something beautiful, your whole reaction is something subjective in that sense. There's an objective thing there, but my reaction, which is something before I even think about it, like if I stand before a waterfall and my breath is just taken away, this response to beauty, this is what's so great about von Balthasar, is that this is what he dedicated his life to, is thinking about this.
Yeah, but the thing is that the beauty is in the thing beheld, not in the eye of the beholder.
It's both. It's both.
It's both.
2 to 1.
Well,
Go for it, Father. Father, you explain
by
this.
all means, and I'm happy to come back this time. Then on this one, I will argue.
All right.
Father.
Well, he will talk a little later. Hopefully, we'll get to it today about the objectivity of beauty. But we perceive beauty, and that's a subjective thing. But the beauty is in the thing itself, which we perceive. That's the case. I want to say a couple of things related to this and what you've just said. Number one, you've even talking about responding properly even before you learn why it's good to respond that way. It's important for children to hear beautiful music from the earliest ages, in the womb for that matter. It actually helps form the neurons in their brain in a way that it turns out to be better for them intellectually and emotionally in the future. So there's something about our correspondence with the real. Truth is part of that, of course, that's knowledge, but also we have to somehow resonate with the harmony of the sphere, so to speak, that we have to communicate with the objective thing that's there. That's not the same thing as saying that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The eye of the beholder needs to behold what's there, and insofar as he does that, he will benefit from the beauty that he's experiencing. And I do agree that there's something in us innately, because we're made in the image of God, that responds to goodness, to truth, and to beauty. So we will see the waterfall and have something which will hit us as beautiful before we rationalize it.
Yes.
But that's because ultimately it conforms to reason.
And I wanted to say this too on that topic, and Vivian, you mentioned it too about emotions are neither good nor bad, but they can be ordered or disordered. I mean, this parallels very closely with Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises, where the whole point is to rid oneself of disordered attachments, he calls them, so that we may do the will of God and order our lives properly. But a disordered attachment is also a disordered emotion. I mean, I like this, I like that, And so one reason that Ignatius, after his first more intellectual first weekly exercise, where you're thinking on principles about sin and redemption and so on, in the second week, he introduces contemplation. He wants us to see Jesus, to hear what he says, to smell what it's like there, to feel the vibration, whatever, to the sense experience of the Jesus and his apostles is there to help train our emotions so that they will, in fact, support and not
Just
resist.
a sec.
Or, I have my phone here only for the clock value, but this Siri will, when I want her to do something, she is completely resistant and
she's a heckler, Father.
But-
You have a techno heckler.
then she'll just speak up. Okay, anyway, those are the 2 points I wanted to make here. On this chapter 3, there's one little general element he brings out about music having it can communicate, and it does that through expectation fulfillment. That is, once you understand something about music and harmony and so on, then it sets you up to want to get to that home chord, for example, and then whether you get there or not, tells you a little story. So I thought it was pretty good the way he describes how music can communicate meaning.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
and then-
I'm happy just from the point of view of keeping us moving through the text before we run out of time again to move on to chapter 4.
Okay,
Yes.
go ahead. Well, now chapter 4 is a long chapter, and there's a lot in there. So I don't want to, neglect anything important, but let's move forward in there.
Well, I've got something on page 80, so does anybody beat that?
Oh, 80? Oh my, I've got 3 things before that.
Oh, go on, off you go.
Page 71, below the middle there. I dare to say that never has high art or fine art, especially contemporary classical music, been more utterly incomprehensible to the common man. And that echoes something I think we said last time. Whether you take architecture in our buildings, the Guggenheim Museum, or you take art and some of the Cubist stuff or whatever, or you take music with atonal stuff, no normal person really enjoys watching, seeing, or listening to those things.
Right. Now, Father, I do appreciate that the author, he doesn't just say, okay, so this stuff is terrible, nobody likes it, these people are terrible, let's move on. He does, for example, on page 70, he tries to give a little bit of historical background. Around the turn of the 20th century, all the fine arts experienced radical changes, partly in reaction to world events, and I might insert there 2 world wars, and so on, and partly in reaction to what artists perceived as art itself having reached some dead ends in the decades just before. And I'd like to add there, for example, Impressionism was in part a reaction to photography, right? Because photography was coming into vogue, and now this kind of realistic portraiture and everything that photographs could do. And many of these Impressionist painters were looking for other ways to do painting. So I like the fact that he has a balanced view. However, that does not stop him from calling a spade, so to speak, and pointing out the fundamental disorder of the 12-tone series system, where you can't repeat another note until you've gotten through all 12, and now there's no discernible pattern for the ordinary person, and then all the discordance, everything. Where is it where he says he did a little survey and let an 8-year-old listen to it who just said, that's ugly, so I like this balanced approach that he has, where he understands kind of how we got to where we are, but he's certainly not going to hold back from calling it what it is.
Well, you ask your 9-year-old, you get the Emperor's New Clothes scenario, right?
Well,
Yeah,
yes, and
exactly.
I
Pointing
will.
out, that's ugly.
And here's something that happened around the year 2000. I remember very much because Vivian, we were down in Taberna, one of those family type things. We had a dinner down there, and it was prior to 2000 because Pope John Paul II was encouraging some new churches to be built around Rome. And so they had these architectural designs, all these modernistic designs. And we showed them to your son Thomas, who at that time would be, when 2000, how old was he in 2000? Anyway, 8 or 9, something like that.
Yeah, how old was he?
He says, it doesn't look like a church. I said,
Yeah.
yes, you got it, man. On page
And fast forward, when the new cathedral in LA was built,
oh, yes.
and he went to see it in a field trip with some other boys, he said it was so disconcerting because it was almost deliberate for the way the lines were used to keep you unable to make order out of it. And somewhere in this book, Kurek says exactly the same thing about this attempt. And then I thought of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. Remember when Ransom is put in that room and all the pictures are crooked and all the corners are off and everything?
Yeah.
I mean, this really is a form of torture to be subjected to this, whether it's an architecture or art or music. It really is torture.
Well, your other son, Stephen, is, of course, an architect, an artist and semi-architect. But I always wanted him to paint the bare concrete walls of St. Mary's Cathedral with frescoes, put mosaics in there, But but when he applied to Notre Dame and was accepted with a wonderful essay he wrote on St. Mary's, he said, no, we have to tear it down. I have a plan to do something different.
Yeah, that guy's a hoot. Okay, well,
Anyway, all right.
moving on. Where do we want to go next?
73, top of the page. Is everything in art relative? And can music thus do or be anything it likes? Or are there instead universal principles that lead a musical composition to become a timeless masterwork instead of a forgotten experiment? That's a very well articulated sentence. And the answer to that is no, you can't do anything you want and make it music. The cat wandering on the keys or me dabbling on the keys is not music.
Or dropping a piano from a helicopter.
Yeah.
What's actually very interesting on this, I don't know where it plays into anything, is that you can't do anything kind of anarchy. My son, Leo, who has Down syndrome autism, is 18 years old now, plays the piano much better than I do. Because somehow or other he has an ear, right? He just knows what sounds good as opposed to what doesn't. Whereas I get on there, I just do sound like something should not be let loose,
And yet, as he points out on page 77, where he says, when he was teaching, well, before that he talks about when he was a student, but the fact that this was blackballed, the ability to make beauty was blackballed. It was he calls it the kiss of death to his career in the concert hall if he had been not producing modernist music. And then he goes on, talks about the concert halls, the performing arts organizations, and he talks about this trick of, I'm a concert goer, I go to the symphony, I go to the opera, I go to all these things, and wouldn't you know, when they advertise the billing for that particular performance, they put out, we're going to play Mozart, we're going to play Bach, we're going to play this. You show up, and guess what the first thing they play is? Some wretched, and he talks about this, how they kind of slip it into the repertoire, sometimes not even alerting audiences that that's what they're going to do.
That was actually the point on page 80. One of the reasons for that is federal funding. That in order to get funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, they have to play new things. So same thing. We destroyed education through federal funding, and we're actually financing this music nobody wants to hear. As he says, it's normally played once, and that's it. And it's played for the money. This is the irony of these people with integrity. It's only because of prostitution that any of it's ever played.
Right.
Because they need the money, so they put it on the menu. They don't tell you it's on the menu because you might stop you coming to the feast, right?
Oh, I can't tell you how many times.
Feed it to you.
I can't tell you how many times my husband and I have been subjected to this. I mean, one piece, there was a pizza delivery man, and there were doorbells and things. And, okay, it was sort of comical, but it couldn't possibly be defined as music.
Well, that's what the other thing he does say, that ultimately the only way this stuff becomes more popular is to make it comic.
Yes.
Find the gimmick. So in
Yes.
other words, nobody wants it. If you make them laugh, then these people won't despise it, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So having him explain all of this is great.
I have to briefly go back to page 75 because I want to offer a tribute to a deceased friend of mine, Father Gerrit Hefner. He and I were Jesuit scholastics together in France back in 1969, 70, and so on. He's German, wonderful man, very cultured. But on page 75, Kurek talks here about the score versus the music and how some of these modernist music writers, they appreciate the score because they can see the mathematical relations and stuff like that, but most people can't hear it. And he says about a third of the way down, within some academic circles, I believe it is a transcendent conceptual aspect, that is the score, that matters more, not so much how the work in its imminent incarnation actually sounds uninformed. Well, I remember my friend Gerrit, because he loved music and he was a German, but he would rather read the score to one of Beethoven's symphonies than go listen to it. I mean, he actually got more pleasure out of this intellectual, seeing these mathematical relationships than actually listening to the music. I said, well, that's great, Gerrit. I'm going to go listen to it, but so I can understand that someone who's really well educated or, technically so in music might find a tremendous mathematical beauty in looking at the score and not have to hear it, but that's not what music is for. Anyway, that was just a little excursus I wanted to make. Gerrit was a good man, a good priest, good Jesuit. Like many of my Jesuit friends of that time, French and German, their fathers died in the war. So they grew up without a father. But that was the thing. In 1969, it wasn't that long after the war, how these French and German Jesuit scholastics got along and loved each other. Think about that after their fathers had killed each other, All right.
Father, I'm really glad you brought that up about the intellectual pleasure that some people do derive from this exercise because they understand the music, they can read it on the page, and they understand its inner workings. And Kurek mentions this a number of times. We are dealing now with a kind of elite group of musicians who understand this stuff, appreciate it at that level, but that's kind of leaving the rest of us out in the cold, because if we can't enjoy it when we listen to it, we're going to stop going, which is what's happened. And however, he does very soberingly on the bottom of page 81 describes a different phenomenon about how some current and former members of this ivory tower culture have essentially become disordered listeners who can no longer tell the difference between serious classical tonal music with counterpoint, modulation, harmonic tension, and form, and most simplistic commercial new age music, which exhibits none of these traits. So over time, if this is all you're involved in, is the writing of this kind of music, and now you've lost your ear to hear something beautiful just in its own right, and you can't distinguish that from something in the elevator because it's got harmony and melody, and this is a sad thing.
So also it's right across the board where we have basically nihilism. That you have, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is now saying it's beyond any doubt that Shakespeare was bisexual. If people can really read Shakespeare's work and see nothing but sexuality in it, they're not seeing it at all, because it's not what it's about, right? These people have started looking for an agenda to make right, and it's exactly the same thing with these people. It's the whole deconstructionist aspect that's trumped their love for music. They can't even hear beautiful music anymore, even though they're supposed to be musicians.
Well, I'm laughing because when my daughter was studying literature at Berkeley, she came home from one of her classes and she said, if my teacher finds one more penis on the page of so-and-so, I'm going to scream.
So Shakespeare's basically writing graffiti on a toilet wall, right? I mean,
she was, because there's all these, as you say, Joseph, there are all these kinds of schools, like this is the Marxist criticism school and the feminist criticism school, and it just goes on, and after a while, the work they're looking at has gone completely missing.
Right. Yeah. They're looking at these great works from a very narrow optic and judging it on that, and it's exactly like the so-called cancel culture. You look at great men and great women who have flaws, and if all you're looking at is what the flaw is, or did he have a slave or not, or what was his gender view? I mean, you are no longer able to see the beauty or the goodness or the greatness of some of these flawed human beings, but who were nevertheless great heroes.
And there's completely no difference between that than a Nazi who can't see someone as a great scientist or a great artist because he's a Jew.
Yes.
Right? It's exactly the same thing. It's a blindness that leads to hatred. And that's what we're experiencing now. The ironic thing is that the Antifa, the anti-fascists are fascists. They have exactly the same psychology as the Nazis. And on that point, when we've really got off track.
Yes.
And we've been going for half an hour. I don't know whether we want to have this discussion offline, Father, but we might want to at least consider giving this an extra week.
I think we should. I think let's do a half hour, 35 minutes, and we'll get as far as we get. And we don't have a production schedule here we have to follow. So
right.
I think we should enjoy ourselves. And if others enjoy it, that's wonderful. If they don't, we've enjoyed ourselves.
It's true.
That's good.
It's like the way Ignatius Press publishes books. We don't have focus groups. We love books. We love the church. We love the truth. We love beauty. We come together and we just say, well, let's publish that, And fortunately, there's other people out there who have the same sensibilities and want to read it. So let's do the same thing for music and for this book. So we'll come back next week and we'll start on page 83 or around there, 84 maybe, the points of narrative. And then just to give a little look into the future, because we'll be finishing this book in 2 or 3 more weeks. And the one we're going to do after that, we've decided, I believe, is a short...
Hans Urs von Balthasar.
A short primer
for the unsettled layman.
Right. And so Hans Urs von Balthasar, a short primer for the unsettled layman. After that, we'll do Father McTague's book on philosophy for ordinary people.
Real philosophy for real people.
There you go. All right. Joseph, Vivian, thank you very much. It's been enjoyable. And to all our listeners and viewers out there, God bless you all and see you next week.